All right, we're back. It is 5:25, and so good afternoon and welcome to the second session of the State Water Board Workshop to receive comments regarding drought activities in the Bay Delta watershed. Maybe some of you who weren't here before. Anybody who wasn't here before? Okay. If you're new and you're just not fessing up, ask people who we are and what the evacuation procedure is. I'm not doing it again. But just remember to speak into the microphone, but not too close, and to turn your cell phones to silent. This workshop is being held in accordance with the public notice dated May 1st, 2015, and revised on May 18th. This is an informal workshop. The State Water Board will not take any formal action, and there will be no sworn testimony or cross-examination of participants. The board members and its staff may, however, ask clarifying questions of speakers. After receiving comments at this workshop, the State Water Board may provide direction to staff regarding future activities. We will be focusing on drought-related water right curtailment in the Delta watershed. We'll start with an introduction from the State Water Board staff, and that'll be followed by public comments, really a conversation amongst us and with you. And the number of comment cards at the moment, people will have 5 minutes when we get to that, but anticipate that we'll probably ask you a lot of questions as well. And with that, I'm going to turn right to staff.
Hi, I'm Kathy Maroka. I'm with the Division of Water Rights. I'm the Program Manager for Enforcement, and the curtailment program is coordinated through my program. So I wanted to talk to you today about the drought-related curtailments. Curtailments can be issued for 3 reasons. They can be issued because a water right has a term in it that requires parties to cease using water under specific conditions. We have Term 91 in the San Francisco-San Joaquin Bay Delta. It can be issued due to overall watershed conditions, or it can be issued because of specific fishery needs. Thus far this year, we've seen a number of curtailments issued. We've seen 3 fishery needs curtailments: Scott River, Deer Creek, and Antelope Creek. We've seen 2 of the watershed-wide, Sacramento River and Delta, and San Joaquin River, and those were for the post-1914 water rights. And we've seen 1 curtailment for our permit condition, Term 91. So the interesting thing is, how many people has this affected? I think that's a more difficult statistic, because we are counting 8,942 water rights curtailed thus far. When you look at how this breaks out and you say, oh, is it a lot of fishery curtailments? Is it the general watershed conditions? And frankly, the fishery curtailments are only numbering roughly 300 parties affected. The rest of this is due to the horrific watershed-wide conditions. Now, when we issue a curtailment notice, we ask parties to respond back to us and tell us if they are complying with that curtailment. And I wanted to talk to you briefly about our success ratio. And I want to say it's really poor. We've only received 20% response rate for the San Joaquin River, and we've seen a 29% response rate for the Sacramento River curtailed rights. So we've gotten very poor responses. I wanted to tell you briefly about how we've used information from our prior informational orders to try and help us on our curtailment efforts.
Is this going to follow on the poor response, or if I have a question on the poor response, should I ask
I
it
just
now?
wanted to report on the poor response rate.
But how does that compare with last year?
Last year we had a better response rate, at least 10% better on the response rate. This year it's somewhat worse.
That's interesting.
And it's particularly bad on the fishery-related curtailments. So last year, fishery-related curtailments could send paper forms in. This year, they have to send in data electronically. For Scott River, we're only at a 9% response rate. So although we didn't see a lot of parties affected, we also saw a very, very poor response rate. So what that means to me on coordinating our enforcement efforts, it means that I need to target resources to those areas where we have poor response rates to determine whether parties are complying with the curtailment. And the next slide deals with how we prioritize those inspections. But I did want to finish first with the general information.
Okay.
Can you tell if there might be an issue about electronic reporting? Are you getting people to, send in a written report saying they don't have access?
Well, the interesting thing about electronic reporting is it's our sole method of reporting for water right holders when they report their yearly water use. We no longer have any paper reporting allowed.
So they should be able to then?
Yes, and we've done a lot of outreach through farm bureaus and others to try and teach people how to do our forms. What we looked at this year was streamlining and whether we could, relieve some of the burden on the water using community. Last year, there were two different kind of curtailment forms you had to fill out. One to tell us if you had stopped using water, and one to tell us if there was an applicable health and safety claim. So this year, everything's on one form. We try to help out on that. We tried to make it a simpler form to navigate. We tried to do what we could with respect to that so that it'd be a little less burden on the water using community. Earlier this year, we had issued an informational order to the top 90% of water diverters in the Delta and 90% of the remaining Sacramento and San Joaquin basins. And we have used the data, the 2014 data on their water diversion and use in our modeling, so we'd already incorporated it in curtailment modeling. What I haven't reported to you previously is what do we see and how does it compare the 2015 initial reporting versus 2014 data. So now we've got 2 months of 2015 data that's come to us. And what we're showing is that, we'd asked these people to project what they thought they used in 2015. Now we're getting the actual numbers. March was 14% less. The actual was 14% less than the projected data for 2015. April, the actual use was 23% less than the projected. So we're seeing that people are using less than they thought they were going to need to use for 2015. Way less than the face value. And the 2014 data, we had seen that where parties reported to us and said that they have used a lot less. But our last year's experience, we went out and did 950 field inspections on curtailment last year. And our number one finding from those field inspections was that people were complying with the curtailment because their streams were dry. That was the most frequent thing, go out, look. They were complying, but it's because the conditions are so bad.
To divert?
Yes. So, we found a high compliance rate, but it's for the worst darn reason. So this year, we're getting our field crews out in the field. We started May 1st, and we're using the same criteria that we used last year to prioritize who we look at. Failure to respond to the curtailment certification form, size of diversion, is it currently their diversion season, where are they located geographically, and flow conditions.
That's just because you're being, I remember this from last year, just being efficient. When you send the team out, you're looking in one geography.
Yeah, we are looking at that too. Last year we experienced a tripling of the water right complaints, and so, we have some areas that we like to focus this year. We wanted to try and see, what's going on in specific areas. More than that, we want efficient investigations. We want them to cluster them so that their day's effort is meaningful. There's certain things we do for efficiencies within the program. And I really thank the Department of Water Resources. They are loaning us 8 staff persons to assist with this effort. So very, very appreciative of that. And other divisions here at the State Water Board are also loaning us staff. And so we're very appreciative of that assistance. Future curtailments. The San Joaquin River watershed pre-1914 rights, we are expecting to issue curtailment this Friday. San Joaquin River watershed, the riparian rights, by June 15th. And we're still reviewing the Sacramento River watershed and Delta pre-1914 water rights. And we don't have a recommendation yet on that. Now, there are special circumstances that apply to the curtailments. For hydropower projects, if the diversion is for hydroelectric generation by direct diversion only, and all water diverted is returned to the same stream system, continued diversion is allowed. Because basically, you're putting back what you take out, you're not affecting someone. For all diverters, water collected to storage prior to curtailment may still be beneficially used. And then we have another category because there's only a health and safety exemption for fishery-related curtailments. There is one there, but there's not one for general watershed-based curtailments. What we're doing, though, is on the compliance certificate, we're asking parties, are you needing to comply with directives issued by the Division of Drinking Water or local health or drinking water regulation to provide water to meet human health and safety needs? And these we evaluate on a case-by-case basis. Because although there are no exceptions for this, there's certainly enforcement discretion. And we want to know about those cases so we know when we need to use our enforcement discretion.
Right, and in those orders, as I understand it, there are very strict conservation limits, no watering outdoors, hookup
Right.
moratorium and the like.
It's very minimal use. That's correct. So that concludes my presentation on this topic. I will be doing another presentation on another topic. Did you have questions for us? I think there'll be a number of questions from other speakers. Yeah. So now I wanted to talk briefly about the Hydropower Program. Okay. We have a role in hydropower because we act under Section 401 of the Federal Clean Water Act to determine conditions in FERC licenses. And licensees have requested temporary variances to the conditions in their water quality certifications for affected FERC projects. Most variance requests are to reduce minimum in-stream flows. Increasing water in storage benefits summer peak power generation and helps satisfy water supply and maintain in-stream flow releases later in the year. As background, under Section 401 of the Clean Water Act, water quality certifications outline conditions to protect water quality and beneficial uses. The State Water Board has received and acted upon several requests for variances, and just to point out two of them, Pacific Gas and Electric Company and Tridamps projects on the Middle Fork Stanislaus River asked us to allow them to forgo supplemental flows and recreational flows to maintain storage for use later in the summer for power demands and continued in-stream flow releases. Another example is El Dorado Irrigation District's project on the South Fork American River. The State Water Board approved reduced minimum stream flow requirements so that EID could preserve storage and satisfy water supply demand. We are anticipating that there will be additional requests for variances, and the variances are normally approved by the executive director and in some cases by the deputy director for water rights. Some variances are occurring without the State Water Board's approval as there is no certification in place for the project. So if we don't have a certification, we don't have a nexus for any action on our part.
I guess on that point, is variance from what then, if there's no condition in a
They'll still have to go to FERC and ask for variance in their operating conditions,
from FERC?
but we just would not have anything but an advisory role.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And then I did want to mention that the governor has a hydropower working group. This is multi-agency coordination. Since early 2014, staff from the California Energy Commission, California Public Utilities Commission, Department of Water Resources, State Water Board, and the California Independent System Operator have been coordinating weekly to monitor and assess drought impacts on hydroelectric and other sources of power generation. This working group extends beyond hydropower as other sources of generation, such as gas-fired power plants, also rely on stable water supplies to generate power. The working group is continuously assessing California's electric grid capabilities under the drought and proactively following up on potential areas of concern. So in 2015, it's always fun to, take a look, see what we're estimating. We're estimating grid reliability remaining good overall. The 2015 projection for hydropower generation is 49% of the annual average. But, some of the loss in hydropower generation is being made up for by additional capacity from new generation, transmission upgrades, increased reserve margins to meet peak summer conditions, and moderate load growth. And that concludes this presentation.
That's it?
I'm done.
All right. So, and I'm going to ask you to step in and help me, or this is an opportunity. This is a little different than the TUCP workshop that so many of you sat through. Appreciate that you did. That is an issue on which, because there are petitions, we can't talk to people. On the curtailment issue, we have talked to many of you, and we appreciate your engagement in, I think, a rather different way than last year. And I just wanted at the outset to thank people for some of the creative and engaged things that they tried to do, as well as the information that people have been sharing. So I just wanted to say that. And then the goal of this is just to open it up. Okay. I don't know why I was expecting more. I was. No critique. I just was. All right. With that, our first speaker is Dante John Nomalini. Yeah, but we don't have that many cards, so I'm not going to be that tough. He can't have 20, but I'm not going to. Yeah. Wait. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say the person after you gets to decide how many minutes you get. How about that? What do you think about Herrick deciding how many minutes you get?
I don't agree, but we'll work that out outside the hearing.
I was going to order a cup of coffee for John earlier today. He was just yawning all morning. I was going to try and share with you. What? You were just yawning to get more oxygen so that you could really pay attention. Sorry, Mr. Nomalini.
Yes,
please.
Dante John Nomalini, manager and co-counsel for Central Delta Water Agency. We understood our instruction to combine our comments on both topics, so I will deal with the curtailment as well as the temporary urgency change. Of course, our concern is very high with regard to curtailment of water diversions in the Delta. We believe the water supply in the Delta not only includes flows from the east, but it flows from the west, and we have ample water continue to pump in order to farm, and therefore water quality is the concern. Now, I recognize we probably have some legal disputes on that. Just to let you know, we plan to engage on that subject. Hopefully we can get them aired out somewhere along the road so we don't have to fight over it constantly. But we're at the time we're under the threat of curtailment. If you haven't done it yet, it's really affecting our people and their ability to continue to function. We're very disappointed that we've transitioned, even though our agencies haven't been at the forefront of negotiations over water banking or fallowing in the Delta for compensation. That fell apart, and now we're dealing with an avoidance or our landowners' avoidance of prosecution and penalties in exchange for foregoing their water use. I view that as a switch from an economic voluntary banking program to one of reacting to extortion under threat of curtailment and penalty. Of course, I have no enthusiasm for that. As a lawyer, I think it's wrong, and therefore we're going to engage, on whether or not your process is appropriate for that. I recognize the curtailment of the Delta notice has not gone out yet for pre-1914s in the Delta or riparians, and I understand from just the brief presentation that decision hasn't been made yet. I suspect it's forthcoming. There are a couple of things I'm going to kind of repeat to you what I've said to you before, that after 2013, I believe in 2013, the reservoir storage was depleted wrongfully. And the fishery agencies, in my opinion, were a party to it. They said, let the critical year criteria dominate for Delta agriculture, even though it was a dry year rather than critical under D1641. They didn't say anything about exports. And exports, and I submitted letters to you, exports, I didn't sue on it. I was leaving the sword in the closet. But exports were taking the same water that could have been stored for cold water protection for fish. And that to me was wrong. We hear about water and storage being allowed after the notice of curtailment or as of the date of curtailment as if it's a sacred cow. Just because it's stored in a reservoir doesn't mean it's stored water. The projects have been capturing behind the reservoir water that would otherwise be natural flow to the Delta. Particularly important would be like in April or March, because it would flush the Delta, and of course our concern is water quality. Whatever salinity control is, you've kind of dictated that, but that water is actually natural flow in our view that would have come down, freshened the source of water for our farmers, and we viewed the law to provide for salinity control and a balancing of that by letting people store that water in the early spring months in exchange for some benefit water quality wise in the summer. So that's how we rationalize it. So if you let them take that away and you curtail us later, we view that as a serious wrongdoing, and we understand the law. Of course, we don't have agreement with all your lawyers, but we think the Delta Protection Act says you can't export from the Delta unless the Delta is first provided an adequate supply. Now, exports have been going on without a health and safety restriction. We haven't jumped in to stop that. But on the other hand, if they get to do that and then you curtail us, we think that's really wrong. Your staff presented what I think is factually correct, that the adjustments from 2014 to 2015 mean greater exports. If you saw the pie charts, it's bigger. And for the first series of months, from January 1st up to now, the State Water Project has pumped from the Delta 268,779 acre feet more than in the same period last year. Now, where'd that water go? That water is in San Luis. There's other water in San Luis, but that water is there. So if all of a sudden we start curtailing our Delta diversions, that water, the exporters shouldn't have been able to take that water. They're taking advantage of it unfairly, and I'm not going to attribute why it's occurring. I mean, whether the good reasons or not, the net effect is they've taken water, it's in storage. So that water in storage that came out of the Delta should be available to meet Delta water quality requirements. It can come back in the San Joaquin River. I mean, they've done it as a demonstration project, bringing it down through the Wesley Wasteway. So I view those as examples of what we'd be concerned about in terms of an equitable adjustment. We're not going to just sit back and let a process cripple us while others take advantage, I think, unfairly of it. Now, I've said to you before, I think what we ought to do, and I think you ought to avoid curtailments. Let us sort it out, among ourselves, fight over it. It's not a place for you to go because it's very complicated. From a water rights standpoint, it's very specific to location. Now, I'm not saying that just with regard to the Delta. The Delta, I think, is the easiest case because we have water all the time. But as you go upriver, you're getting involved in very detailed, very site-specific considerations that I think rightfully have to be addressed from a water right administration standpoint. So you think you're protecting senior water rights. What I see is the advantage is to the junior water right holder who claims stored water, the two projects. And they have statutory obligations that are not purely water right. To us, they're statutory rights that regulate what they do. So in any event, I just wanted to alert you, we're still going to work positively on trying to get a better handle on understanding water use in the Delta. We're sending our checks for the 2 SIMA stations. This effort by our water master to get better information. I found 2 sites in the Central Delta. We're going to cooperate. We're going to do that. We're going to try and be responsive. We thought we helped almost everybody that needed help respond to these information requests and the patents and all that. We'll continue to do that.
Well, I do
But
want
as
to
we
mention,
face curtailment,
you did have a 97% response?
Yeah.
It was a huge response.
okay.
You were very
Well, we've
successful,
tried
and
to
I wanted
help,
to express
and
my
we will
appreciation.
continue that. But as we have to become more defensive, we're going to litigate. We personally think our shot is better in court than it is in front of you because of the hyper-technical nature of these questions dominated by staff. We know who staff are. We know what their positions are from past events on these water right issues. So we're going to try and stay in court. That doesn't mean we won't be back here.
We would miss
I know
you.
you said you thought the board ought to do it, but I mean, quite frankly, we
Yeah.
think our best shot is in the courthouse rather than before your board because you're going to defer to staff. Not that you wouldn't go the other way, but these things are so complex. I know what you're going to do. I've only been around all these years.
You have so much
Lost
faith
my
in the
hair.
judicial
It's either
system.
gray or
I'm
gone,
impressed.
and my estimate is that our best shot is in court.
I have a question for you. So you've outlined here that you think we're going to go forward, which it appears that that's where we're headed, but that you mentioned that you ought to be able to work it out yourselves. So how would
Well,
you structure that?
I think water right holders would litigate amongst themselves. I mean, you've seen the San Joaquin River entities join together, which we signed on too, that said, look, stay away from this. Wait till you get a formal complaint. We hear John Rubin come in all the time, beat those guys up and this, that, and the other thing. He hasn't filed anything yet, but he may. And maybe we'll file something that he's interested in. But the parties are well aware, the water right holders. I mean, the people on the Sacramento River that are doing these transfers, we're concerned about the impact of water, groundwater substitution. We didn't bring that to you as a complaint. We mentioned it, but we are litigating the environmental document on long-term transfers. I'm just indicating to you that how those things are going to get sorted out, other than you people jumping in to the fray on what we view as complicated, site-specific, even document-specific challenges. You may want to join them all. It's just okay. But I just wanted to be frank with you, let you know I do appreciate everybody's interest and the effort that's gone in. There's a lot of effort, even at staff, but this is getting real critical. Our guys, this 25% thing, we in the agencies are not going to obstruct it, because people have to take that risk and make that decision as to whether they're going to give up 25% in order to get a non-prosecution type of comfort. I don't know how good that is anyway, but we're not going to interfere, of course, because we can't predict the result. But conceptually, we think it's wrong. We think our rights are senior. We think the statutes are set up to make sure that we come first, that you can't export. You may not want to give us the water that we think we need, but you can't export when we don't have an adequate supply. We think that's the law. And of course, that's kind of an incentive on the projects to try and hammer out a solution with us. You know, we've tried to get some kind of contractual situation because we'd rather have more security. We've been unsuccessful over the years, and there's no mechanism for us to force an arbitration or a good faith negotiation. The statute puts that leverage on no exports, we think. That's where the leverage is. That doesn't mean we're satisfied, but they can't take water out of the Delta unless this thing's resolved. Anyway,
Thank you.
those are my comments. Thank you very much.
Well, we'll be talking more. John Herrick, South Delta Water Agency, followed by, Deirdre Desjardins from California Water Research.
You said that like you don't know me.
Well, I'm trying to be a little more formal. I was too informal, I think.
Thank you, Madam Chair, board members. John Herrick for the South Delta Water Agency. Again, we appreciate everybody's efforts. There's a lot going on, very difficult decisions coming. Hopefully we can all get through this. My comments are similar to what I've said before, and that is I really would like to stress and encourage the board to take a different route for the long term. The short term's too late, but we need to have hearings on this stuff. The urgency statutes or urgency requirements in section, 1425, 35, 25, you know, they're clearly for an emergency event, and they really don't fit here. And I think just a cursory look at the criteria there shows that this is not the appropriate situation for them to be employed. In order to get an urgency permit change, you have to show that it does not adversely affect any legal user of water. Well, if the changes are relaxation of water quality standards to protect legal users, then it's by definition an injury to them. Now, people may disagree the extent of that, and I guess you could couch it in, well, it must be an insignificant one, so we don't have to do it, but it's clearly an injury to legal users. Similarly, it says, shall not unreasonably affect fish and wildlife. Well, obviously that's in a situation where something happens, you can do it at some previously unauthorized action as long as you don't really affect the fisheries or the environment. Well, that's the opposite we're doing here. We're fundamentally altering the minimum flows for the fisheries. And then the last criteria, which I've harped on for 5 years now, and apparently I can't read or something, but the last one says, you know, you can get an urgency change if you've shown diligence in trying to get the change under the normal procedure rather than the emergency one because of all the criteria and the lack of public participation. So I think any honest evaluation of the statute is that this is not the method by which we would have 4 years of delta and upstream operations determined. And, you know, it's not my job to, you know, personally attack the Bureau and DWR. Well, sometimes it is, but you know, we rely on their presentations at these meetings, and you know, everybody couches things to their best interest to some degree, and we just don't get to challenge what they're presenting. We don't even see it till the day of the hearing, but there's all sorts of information that none of us have, especially you, dealing with all these things like cold water supply and previous storage and what's going on here. Those things really need to be aired out with idiot attorneys like me being able to cross-examine so we can actually see. You know, there are hundreds of questions raised by this morning's presentations, but we'll never get to those, literally. So I do encourage the board to undertake, you know, the decision. And I don't know who would fight you on this, but there are probably a lot of people, but you really need to say right now, okay, starting October 1, we're going to have 10 days of hearings for future drought operations. it may be too late. I mean, if it doesn't rain again for another year or two, it may be too late and there's nothing to do. But we can't operate on this urgency basis where it's presentations by the people who control the system, and it's really kind of take it or leave it. Oh, this is all we can do, and we don't get to see what the truth is. So I encourage you to do that. The good news, I think, will be covered by Ms. Spalletta when she gives you an update on the 25% program that she and others have spent a lot of time on. So anyway, thank you very much for your time.
Followed by Steve Arakawa from Met.
Hi, I wanted to congratulate the board because I think this year you are light years beyond last year in terms of your amount of information about what's really going on in the Sacramento Valley.
It may not be saying a lot, but it is a lot better.
Yeah, no, it's very significant, and there's this major conflict in that the Bureau said these guys get 75% of the water that they normally would contract it for, even if Shasta's at dead pool. The Bureau's doing the best to meet the contracts, but obviously they're also trying to maintain cold water pool for salmon. So that's much more in the light right now, and our whole state is better for it. But I have a more fundamental comment, and I really thought today, what would I want to talk about? What is the biggest gap? The biggest gap is DWR is helping to do the curtailment analysis, and the projects aren't looking at the fact that they themselves are curtailed. The Coordinated Operating Agreement, the projects committed in 1986 to always meet all in-basin uses, including delta outflows. And for that reason, the board has always given them wide latitude in operations. I delved into the COA accounting. The Bureau publishes monthly reports of the COA accounting and their delta outflow computations. But the COA accounting only tracks releases of stored water. It aggregates all in-basin uses, and it only loosely tracks the source of water for delta exports. It's never intended for conditions of curtailment of the CVP and state water projects permits to divert unstored water. And I really questioned whether I should bring this up, but reservoir operations, people worked so hard, but curtailment, literally construed, requires full bypass flows from all the rim dams, which is not planned for Folsom or New Melones. And if you're really going to curtail downstream water rights holders, the projects may be needing to provide substitute flow for these water rights holders. While USBR has devoted a lot of attention to meeting their contracts, senior downstream water rights holders, such as those from Mr. Nomalini and Mr. Herrick, may have a stronger claim to these substitute flows than curtailed USBR contractors who may have post-1914 appropriative rights. The water balance reports that Mr. Howard recommended are a really good start, but the information needs to be pulled together in a more complete report that tracks stored and unstored releases and depletions. Diversions by curtailed contractors under the Bureau's permit or state water project contracts, they have to be reported. It should be stored water only, and it needs to be accessed to other in-basin needs. This affects the Sacramento and Feather River settlement contractors, the exchange contractors, and also the City of Sacramento's permits on the American River. And I know you guys have done a lot of work, but the Bureau needs to look at this. Finally, the source of water for exports needs to be tracked. The board has said repeatedly exports are junior to meeting in-basin needs. During curtailment for each project, diversions can be no more than upstream releases less contributions to required outflow. And I noticed, according to the Bureau's March operations forecast, the State Water Project is planning to export more than the Feather River releases from October through January. I don't know when your curtailment project is, but that's what's planned. Transfers, the board is doing way better. They've noticed this year that some of the proposed transfers are from settlement contractors who are curtailed. Those aren't approved. But I noticed there's a long-term transfer. The Yuba River transfer, there was a really big one last year. I looked closely, and your database seems to say that all of the Yuba County Water Agency contractors are post-1914. So the only thing they can transfer is stored water. And there may have been a little more than that transferred last year. So this year I think there's a lot less, but it's something to look at. Similarly, south of Delta, Feinstein passed some language which ended the CVPA requirement that transfers be of water that will actually be delivered and consumptively used for south of Delta transfers. So obviously this could cause a lot of problems, and I just noticed there's a big transfer that was just proposed, and I apologize because I missed seeing the notice, but it's saying that Arvin Edison may transfer up to 150,000 acre-feet of its CVP supplies to Metropolitan Water District this year. And I'm like, what supply? The Bureau hasn't allocated anything. Is that from next year? Are they going to get any water? You know, so I think, you know, you don't want Arvin Edison transferring CVP water to Met until Arvin Edison has an allocation. So those kind of things, I think, need a little more scrutiny, and I'll send this in writing to the board as well.
Thank you. Mr. Arakawa, followed by Terry Erlewine.
Chair Marcus, would it be okay if we reverse the order?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Terry Erlewine on behalf of the State Water Contractors, and I'll be followed by Steve Arakawa from Metropolitan. Wanted to talk about a couple issues, curtailments, and then also talk about water conservation briefly. Before I started to talk about that, though, I wanted to talk about what's happening in terms of operations, and what I've been looking at is what's happening so far in May. And if you just look at the Bureau's operations reports, which were just talked about, the Coordinated Operations Agreement accounting, the Delta Outflow accounting, there's been roughly 300,000 acre-feet of water that's been taken out of the project storage since the beginning of May. So 300,000 acre-feet of water has been taken from Oroville, Shasta, and Folsom, released. Of that, less than 30,000 acre-feet has been exported. So less than 10% of that stored water has gone to the export projects. Roughly 200,000 or so, a little bit more, has gone to outflow. So roughly 60% of the stored water releases has gone to outflow. So if we look at the whole pie, we've got 10% that's going to exports, 60% that's going to outflow,
Meaning
and then the
salinity
remainder is
control,
unaccounted
right?
for.
Primarily salinity control.
That could be, yeah. Although we've been hearing a lot of people talk about one person's salinity control is another person's fishery protection, so.
For drinking water or whatever.
Yeah. Yep.
We were already talking about putting shading into the pie chart.
Yeah, but the point I was trying to make was just that there's 30% of that stored water releases that's not accounted for, and that's really what our focus is that where is that going? And our concern is that there are people that have legitimately superior water rights that are taking some of that water. There are other parties that have not had their water rights defined that are also very well likely taking our water. And that's why we support the actions the state board's been taking in terms of curtailments, because we think that's really the way that's the process that the board needs to go through to make sure that people are taking the water that's legitimately theirs and not taking the water that's being released for outflow needs and other purposes. We appreciate the board's responsiveness to the Bureau and the department on asking for more information from water rights holders. We also think it's positive that we're getting good results, at least in some cases, in responses to the water rights information. We've been pretty interested in the process the Delta Water Master has initiated to modify and improve the water use information. That's so far focused on consumptive use, which is part of the puzzle, but some of the other pieces of the puzzle are direct measurements of surface diversions, direct measurements of discharges back to the river, and all three of those ultimately are things that we believe are going to be necessary for the state board to have in their hands to manage the water rights system. They're also a lot of that information is needed for the projects to be able to operate effectively. So we support those activities. We support what the Delta Water Master is doing. We think that there's actions that need to be taken beyond that. We've actually had some informal contacts with other parties, and I think we're optimistic that there may be an approach there that all of us could agree to something that collectively meets the needs of the board and meets the needs of the operators and is satisfactory to most parties. So we're hoping to continue those discussions. I just briefly wanted to mention that some of our members are ag contractors, ag agencies, and they are implementing major water management measures. They are responding to the shortages in water supply. Kern County Water Agency's got some of the most efficient water use in the state with a lot of drip and micro irrigation. We've got other water agencies, Tulare Lake Basin Water Storage District, where they've had 50% fallowing in the last 2 years, 100,000 acres for both years as a result of water supply shortages. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Steve.
Thank you. My name is Steve Arakawa, and I'm here representing also the state water contractors, but I'm also a staff person for the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. I wanted to first thank the board and all of the time that you're putting in to deal with the situation that we're faced with. It clearly is a set of terrible choices, as you said earlier today, and I remember reading the testimony back in 1976-77 drought about what they were confronted with, and the world is so much more complex now. We want to commend you for the early actions that you've taken with regard to curtailments and understanding how things are developing in the system so that you're able to make decisions in a timely way. I think that given the unprecedented nature and the very severe drought that we're faced with, all parts of the state, and particularly those that count on the Delta, are required and faced with dealing with unprecedented type of things. For example, urban areas in the state project service area have invested in efforts, programs, facilities for years to try to drought-proof their service area and the management of water in their area. But given the severe situation of the drought, we're all being called on to take significant actions. Those actions include meeting the emergency regulations that the state has put forward. Also, in support of that, implementing supply allocation cutbacks with penalties. So when you look at the urban areas within the contractor service area, both in the Bay Area, the Santa Clara Valley Water District, and the Zone 7 agency, those agencies are implementing their mandatory programs. They're implementing rebate programs and other types of messaging to get people to cut back. In Southern California, allocation plans, in addition to ramping up a turf removal program to try to reduce the amount of water in the outdoor area as a long-term trend. We think that it's important as you go through this decision process to uphold the water rights priority system, particularly in a drought situation, and even going forward. I think that's going to be really key, that the state board has a handle on how to implement these types of actions. And we encourage you to take the necessary steps in doing so to protect stored water by the projects. That stored water mainly being used to protect the Delta environment this year, and making sure that any water that is released out of those reservoirs, if it's intended to meet the environmental need, that it's doing that work and not getting lost in the system. We know that you're going to be interested in looking at all kinds of creative solutions, and I think that's appropriate. And I think in doing so, just making sure that the intended outcome is actually occurring, that the water that's being saved is actually being put to the use that it's intended. We want to thank you for holding this workshop, and thanks very much.
Alan Lilly, I have a card, but I don't see him. Alan Lilly. Philip Martin. Oh, followed by Jennifer Spalletta. Thank you.
Good evening, Madam Chair, Board. My comments, I believe, are going to be focused on probably what Jennifer's going to talk about, I believe the 25% reduction program, or proposed program. I'm a farmer in the Tracy area, and my concern regarding this proposed program regards crop insurance, and it's one of the few tools that farmers have to manage drought risk. My question regarding this program is whether or not this voluntary program is compatible with crop insurance, and would ask you to try and word the program so that it is compatible. By doing this, I believe the board can reduce the pain to some of us farmers and increase the participation in this program. Thank you.
I need to understand what you mean by that. You have to be able to plant a crop in order to even apply for crop insurance.
No. If
So
you are
what-
prevented planting because you do not have water, you can file a claim.
So I thought I understood what he was saying, which is to say, you're saying this program, if it evolves into a program,
Correct.
we should try to do it so that folks can claim the 25% on their crop insurance.
Correct.
I have a feeling a voluntary program probably won't, but I'll leave
That's-
that to
that's
the
the
folks
problem
trying to
is,
figure out how to,
The fact that it's worded as voluntary
yeah.
would
right.
lead my, I'm sure that my crop insurance company to not want to pay me if I
Yeah, I would-
voluntarily comply.
That would be my guess. But
What about with respect to the fallowed ground, though?
Correct. We're planting right now, and then probably in the next 10 days we will complete planting. And so any decision the board makes, I would ask that you make it quickly, because if I am going to, most of the costs with these crops are incurred upon planting, probably over 50%. And to get cut off shortly after planting is
no, fair point.
Thank you.
We do recognize that. Thank you.